Turtle Island. What is that? Well, today we have Taylor Keene, a distinguished teacher, community builder, and Native American thought leader from Omaha, Nebraska, who is part of the Omaha tribe and Cherokee tribe. Today we're going to talk to Taylor about his latest book, Rediscovering Turtle Island, an exploration of indigenous cosmology and history in North America. In this groundbreaking work, Taylor examines the complexities of indigenous legends and creation myths, explores the history of the Cahokia Mound Builder Empire, and presents indigenous revisionist history that challenges mainstream narratives. Through his work, Taylor reveals the deep connection between indigenous sacred mathematics and the physical landscape of Turtle Island. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. We're going to dive into Taylor's insight on indigenous history, the preservation of a Native American heritage, and the environmental responsibilities at the heart of indigenous mythology. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, and I know he'll have to be back again for a part 2, author and tribal member Taylor Keene. Taylor, how are you?
Hi, Tony. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on, and I have to say, I'm going to just show this again. I love that coat, by the way, so wherever you got that, I'd like to get one.
That would be really hard to find. That was a joint project probably 10 or 15 years ago between Orvis, I think of them as a fly fishing company, and Pendleton Blankets. And it was, I just happened to be going by Pendleton, Oregon, and stopped by, I guess, one of their craft shops. I don't know what else to call it. And I saw it and I knew I wanted to have it. And ever since then, everybody always
comments on it.
Oohs and ahs over that jacket.
It's gorgeous. It's
never
beautiful.
Seen one again.
Well, I'll have to do my research and see if I can find it. But you're here today to talk about your book.
Yes.
It's called Rediscovering Turtle Island. And so, you know, many of us, people like myself that have no DNA of Native American blood in us at all, we're like, Turtle Island, what is that? So before we even get started, can you explain what Turtle Island means?
Sure. It has to do with one of our creation stories, Tony, and it's a story that is shared amongst many of the tribes within North America, and that spreads between Siouan speakers, Algonquins, Iroquoians, and maybe more.
Right.
Anthropologists, folklorists, mythologists will refer to it as the Earth Diver myth, and it has to do with ultimately indigenous peoples' journey from the stars. And along with this story comes an origin place of the Seven Sisters constellation. The Greek term for that was the Pleiades.
Right.
And then through the journey of the souls, or the path of the souls, river of souls, through the dark rift of the Milky Way, came the original souls to Earth. And
wow.
When they originally made that journey, once they arrived here, it was an all-watery planet, and those souls transformed into 4 animals. And so that's about the basic framework of the story that is universal. After that, there were many different variations based on the tribes, which I always found really interesting. I share a version of that story in my book, one that really stuck with me when I was, I don't know how much younger, but probably in my teen years or early 20s, and just really resonated. And it has to do with the Gian or Degi Ha speaking Siouan folks, which includes my mother's tribe, the Omahas, the Poncas, the Kansa or Kaw, the Wind People, the Osage, Children of the Middle Waters, or the Quapaws, which are downstream. Omaha means the people moving against the current. And that version that I share in the book is probably most akin to a Degi Ha version. But then you have stuff from the Iroquoians and the Algonquins that have a woman who fell from the sky, and the animals are different, but it's all tied to that one story. Ultimately, they all take their try at trying to find something to save them from the all-watery planet, meaning in the story that I share, one of the animals is a deer who is not made for the water. And the one that I share, the common element is turtle. The version I shared has otter and a waterfowl. More often than not, it's a duck, but in some of the tribes, it's a swan, and you see all these different variations. And eventually, one of the animals goes down into the depths. And with that Siouan version that I shared, it is the otter who comes back up. In the Cherokee version, it is a crawdad of sorts who brings back up the earth from the depths, and ultimately shares that with the other souls who had become the first animals on earth. And ultimately, turtle sacrifices itself and puts the clay from the primordial waters onto its back, and from there the land is born, and that's Turtle Island.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you are part of the Omaha tribe.
Omaha and Cherokee, yes.
And Cherokee. So Omaha, we hear a lot about Apache, Sioux, Cherokee. We don't hear as much about the Omaha. Can you explain a little bit more about who the Omaha tribes are, and kind of what because you said there's 4 different animals and each tribe kind of has their own version. What are the 4 animals that the Omaha tribe, and who are they?
Well, the Omahas belong to a language family that we call Degiha, and that was those 5 cognate tribes that I mentioned. So you have the Omahas, the Poncas, the Kaw or Konze, the Osage, and the Quapaw. And those names all have to do with our relationship with one another, when at one point we were one singular tribe and then broke off into smaller groups into their own tribes somewhere around 1,000 years ago. And so constantly there are different migration stories with all of the tribes. To look at any one point and say this is where that tribe was, I think it's really difficult to pin that down. It's just a question of time. So that's what the book is exploring a lot, is my own journey into trying to understand who am I and where do I come from in terms of my ancestry. And ultimately, I was looking at both of my tribes and realized it was just a matter of time to go back into to see when they were near the same places. So arguably, one of those sites has to do with the Mississippian cultures, the mound builders, and you see, I think we're looking at here on the screen.
This was
this is later on. Yeah.
And then I also pulled this picture here. It's kind of
that's also later on. Yeah. So when you see the so you've got in that picture, you've got Poncas and Omahas up north, you've got the Kansa a little bit down, and then you have Otos right there, all on the eastern side of things. This probably has to do with our migrations out of the Mississippian ecosphere of activities from 1,000 years ago, meaning Cahokia. And as a trading empire, that's what I mean by Cahokia. It certainly is evidenced by a city, but from what we can tell, after the collapse or the ending of that grand experiment, the tribes separated and moved elsewhere, and you see the Omahas and the Poncas and the Otos, along with the Iowas, who are not in that map, but it's right on the border of Iowa, and that's where the name comes from. We found ourselves somewhere around 14 and 1500, close to the pipestone quarries on the border of South Dakota, Iowa, and close to Minnesota, and eventually migrated south from there. And so the other tribe that was on that map were the Pawnees. And in terms of what we call Nebraska today, in our language in Omaha, Ponca, and Oto, it's Nibdaska, and it's our word for the Platte River, and it means flat water. So somewhere between 700 years ago is whenever we came into this area, meaning the Omaha, Poncas, Iowa's, Otos, and probably migrated from that point somewhere out of the Great Lakes or out of the sphere of Cahokia. We're not quite sure. But the Pawnees had been there. If you ask them, they'll tell you they've been there for 3,000 years.
Wow.
And so you've got a lot of constant migrations and evolutions and melding of tribes together and dissolution and separating. And it's just a function of time, how it gets really, really complicated.
Not to stray away from the book too far, not because I want to get back to that, but is there one tribe that was kind of the matriarch of the origins of the natives, indigenous people of America? Was there one tribe that existed at one time, or was there always multiple different tribes?
Well, that's an interesting question to ponder and think about. One of the topics I touch upon in the book is how long have indigenous peoples been here?
Right.
So if we're to look at a couple of things, one is just the number of language families, and there are 5 distinct language families across North America, and some linguists would even break that down even further. Only one of those being Siouan, which would encompass all of the tribes that I've just been talking about,
right,
including the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. That's just one language family. And then you have the Cherokees, who are a southern dialect of Iroquoian. So you have all the tribes up in New England speaking variations of Iroquoian. In the Great Lakes area and up into Canada, you see Algonquin speakers. Then you have the Caddoan dialects, and then you have stuff from northern Canada, which is now in the southwest, as well as the Puebloan languages. And so to wrap that back and to use a mathematical model to say, how long would it have taken the original indigenous peoples coming from over in Siberia over here, how long would that take? Take a very long time. Excuse me. Carbon dating has been able to document how far back some of this journey goes, and it's been a really exciting part of anthropology is to see all these things happen. So the original theory that was clung onto by anthropology for a long time was the Bering Strait theory, and why that was the only possible answer is beyond me, as I've studied into the history of that, into the annals of anthropology, and you can find that in my book, trying to understand that. But what we do know is now that there's been carbon dating evidence which blows past the Bering Strait theory, which goes somewhere between 12 and 15,000 years ago. Now that's been pushed back. They found footprints in White Sands, New Mexico, putting that at 23,500 years. And there are paleoanthropologists and anthropologists out there who are now exploring this further. And who knows, we could see that time frame go back and back and back further. The honest answer is that we don't really know, but my guess is it's a very long time. There has been a school of thought which has certainly tried to limit how long indigenous peoples have been in the Americas, and psychologically speaking, I don't know why. I allude to some of that bias in a chapter known as The Founder's Dilemma of America, which seeks to try to understand why is that bias there. Why is there a camp that really tries to limit how long indigenous peoples have been here? Perhaps that has to do with, I would reckon, even a guilty conscience over how things transpired between European newcomers and the indigenous peoples that were there.
And in fact, you mentioned a simulation in your book, which is a nicer way saying cultural genocide. But do you think that's why it's taken so long for American history to be told from the indigenous perspective?
I think so. I think it's, well, large combination of things. I look at the field of anthropology, and as a science, it's relatively new compared to some of the other sciences
Right.
of the academy itself. And, really you just see the origins of anthropology coming to fruition in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when the Bureau of American Ethnology was really established as a branch of the U.S. government, and the Bureau of Ethnology was there. I refer in my book to anthropology as being the handmaiden for federal expansionist doctrine. So, as the United States was growing and wanted further space, they looked to anthropology to help document things. And there's certainly an era in the late 1800s where you have this spirit of what was being thought about at the time, probably embodied in artists, photographers like Edwin Curtis, as dealing with the vanishing race of indigenous peoples. So in some of these conversations between famous chiefs and Indian agents for the United States government, and there was a lot of corruption that was uncovered, lots of conflicts of interest, and that goes back to the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who had financial interest in things like the Virginia Land Company.
Mm-hmm.
And that was before there was Sarbanes-Oxley and all these moral and ethical rules about things. And there was a lot of speculation on land and when things were going to be annexed. And, there was a brand new system. But I write in the book that Thomas Jefferson was the architect of dispossession. Somebody had to figure it out legally, how to do this and how to get all the land from the tribes. And I put that into the book, some of the writings of Thomas Jefferson, who started off very benevolent. And I think he himself was torn between his original thoughts and then his role and stresses of being a leader of the country and trying to understand what to do with a growing American population and trying to deal with the indigenous peoples who had been there. Interestingly, or ironically, Thomas Jefferson was very interested in the earthenworks or the mounds. And he had one in his backyard at his home and would often dig in there. And he did some pretty extensive writings in linguistics, trying to understand how the tribes were interrelated, or was the language from somewhere else in Europe. So
that's pretty. I did not know that. I didn't know he had a mound in the background.
He was very interested in trying to find commonalities in indigenous languages and ties to other linguistic models. And how he did that at the time is beyond me, but it was very labor intensive, and he was very serious about it. But at that point, there was only broad theories, and right. In the 1840s to the 1860s, ultimately, early amateur anthropologists, their last names were Squire and Davis, put together a work that was the first publication for the Smithsonian and therefore an extension of the Bureau of American Ethnology, which talked about the ancient earthenworks and the antiquities of America. Squire and Davis documented a lot of these theories, but the theory at the time, going back to Jefferson, et cetera, was who were the people that built these? And originally the thought was that the American Indians could not have built them because they were savages and primitive. So that prevailed in the academy and until Cyrus Thomas wrote the sort of definitive volumes for the Bureau of American Ethnology, where he basically said at the end, no, the Indians built these, and there is no vanishing race or lost tribes of Israel or lost Vikings or whatever else that came and built them in place of the Indians. The indigenous populations built them. Fast forward 100, 120 years later, we have a much greater understanding of what the earthenworks are.
Right.
And before this podcast was recording, you and I were discussing another fascinating place at Zenoa.
Right next to where I grew up.
Right. And it's another one of these larger societies. National Geographic has done some fascinating work in the past few years using technologies like LIDAR to look and to find evidence of further civilization, say down in Guatemala and Mesoamerica, and we're seeing the extent of the Mayan Empire. One of my favorite topics is the early civilizations that you see down in South America. One of my favorite films and books, The Lost City of Zed. Use the British term for the letter Z, but explorations for that and how the Royal Academy over in Britain really didn't want to believe that indigenous peoples were capable of building these grand societies. And now we look back and we look at the history of Turtle Island all across the Americas and see much different perspectives than what most of us were taught, including myself in grade school. That this land was a vast wilderness inhabited by nomadic peoples, when in actuality there were trading empires and cities and networks of all types and religions, and a much different world than we see today. So ultimately, all of that, to me, Tony, says that we as Americans have a provenance to this land that we should all be proud of and be very interested in, and that we should do whatever we can to save that history and to learn more about it. It can only enrich in the provenance of the land and the people.
I totally agree, and that's one reason I told you earlier I started the Earthly Beings Foundation to help preserve, because I think giving a voice to not only native indigenous people, but a lot of cultures around the world that are losing languages and traditions and just understanding of where many of us came from, and we just a lot of people come to our country and not want to share continue their language to their children, and that leads me to the question is most indigenous tribes. How is it now in 2024 for people that are listening to this in the future about preserving your tradition and languages to your children to continue, the survival of your tribes?
Why is that important? Or
no, not why is it important. I think it's very important, but why are they doing that? Are they, and how is the young people with now so many distractions of trying to go get better jobs and social media? How are you preserving, Omaha tribe to keep the traditions going with your youth?
Well, that's a great question, Tony. We've been diligently trying to save our language within the Omaha tribe and my father's tribe, the Cherokees, as well, although they're a much larger tribe and a greater number of fluent speakers just by the size of the tribe. But within the Omahas, I hate to even keep track anymore of how many fluent speakers that we have left. My mother is 84, and she's one of them, but we're losing them very rapidly.
Right.
At the same time, we have been embarking on language preservation efforts for quite some time, and most of the tribes are doing something like that. I'm very proud of my mother's tribe, the Omahas, in that our language preservation project is situated right in the middle of our Omaha Nation public school system. And one of the projects that's really given me hope here more recently has to do with the public school system and the combination of our language programs and what has to do with our indigenous agricultural lifeways. And they've got greenhouses and fields, and they have gone backwards in exploring how to organically grow the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash. Actually, the Omahas have a fourth sister because of all the wind on the plains, and that's the sunflower.
Right. Yeah.
And probably needed in Kansas as well.
They do.
And it's been a wonderful thing to observe all of these younger people. When I started my nonprofit, Sacred Seed, a little over 10 years ago, there seemed to be very little interest in the tribe. And I say that lightly and in a very honest way, saying we hadn't got organized yet. It wasn't that the people weren't interested or there weren't stories about corn, bean, and squash within the tribe, because there certainly was, but there was not a unified, coherent effort. And I remember at a certain point bringing back some of these original varieties that I had discovered along my journey and sharing them with people, and they didn't quite know what to make of them. And now, fast forward 10 years later, and you see all of these youth within the Omaha tribe not only knowing how to do the farming, but involved in it and knowing how to describe them in our language, and setting up farmers markets and taking
Oh, that's
excess
great.
crops and helping feed the elders within the tribe. And it's just really powerful to see whenever a tribe is going through a cultural resurgence. And so I think you're seeing that amongst a lot of tribes, and it gives a lot of us hope that we're going to be able to hold on to our language and our cultural lifeways, and they're going to help sustain us and help us build stronger future for the next generations.
I love to hear that. That means a lot to me, because I think it's so important to know where we came from. So there is a common thread in the indigenous spirituality in connection to man, to nature. Is that still apply today? And how can we, if that's true and it still applies, how can we overflow that into all of mankind? How do we introduce that?
I write a little bit about this in the book, and it's certainly been something I've been trying to explore for a number of years. I refer to the sort of philosophy as thinking red, and the application of that as living red, protection of water and land resources. And I give some examples around that, some of the land and seed sovereignty movements that I've been a part of, or a little piece of, over the years. But I was really impressed when I was younger by some of the thought leaders at the time, one of which was the late John Trudell, who was actually born in Omaha and was one of the leaders of the American Indian movement in the late 1960s and the early 70s. And he was one of the leaders of the peaceful occupation at Alcatraz Island outside of San Francisco back in the late 60s. And John's, JT, as a lot of us think of him as, had some really cool things to say. And at a certain point, somebody was questioning what was his relationship as an indigenous person who lived in an urban environment. And I'm paraphrasing his answer, but it had something to do with along the lines of, you're missing the point of what it means to be indigenous. To be indigenous as a mindset is to understand one's relationship to everything around you. And he was describing the environment in urban, said, so when we're talking about, say, there's a lot of asphalt or concrete or steel, aren't all these things from the mother? Yes, they are. So this is a part of nature, and this is my nature. And I always found it so profound that he looked at things that way. And at another point, he was being questioned about, are we doing damage to Mother Earth? And that's our conception. Land is the religion. And I'll get to Vine Deloria's thoughts in a moment. But I'll never forget, at a certain point, JT was talking about what it meant to be in a long-term relationship with Mother Earth as human beings. And I think the whole notion, the topic of sort of nuclear war was looming ever in people's minds, and especially probably during the mid-'70s when he was one of the younger leaders of the American Indian movement, the Red Power movement. And at one point, what he shared was, at our worst, we may burn the skin of the mother, but the mother will live on. And that's always been quite the thought for me, that if we screw this up, we'll destroy ourselves. But the mother is an ecosystem, and at our worst, we'll burn her skin, but she will adapt and thrive again. Vine Deloria talked a lot about it in his different writings around the same time frame. He wrote Custer Died for Your Sins in the late 60s. And in the early 70s, he wrote God is Red, which I quote from pretty extensively in my work. And ultimately, when I first read it in my 20s and in college, I didn't quite get it. I had to read both of those two again in my 30s. And at that point, I realized he was talking about what I thought was sort of protesting of the Red Power movement. Still didn't get it. And it wasn't until my 40s that I read it again and was like, okay, I think I get it now. And what he was describing was the role of Mother Earth and sacred geography as the core of the indigenous religions. And it finally sunk in that celebration between humans and Earth is a very close relationship, and that the things that he was pointing out, people protesting for fishing rights, et cetera, what I viewed as a protest was more of a celebration and a defiance to keep these things sacred. And that was a starting point for me as I've gone further into understanding that philosophy and further into understanding the role of the symbols and cosmology associated with the Mississippian periods and ancient Native America, was that it's not just the relationships of humans to Earth, but to earth and sky. And so when you're looking at a lot of the earthenworks, and I go into probably somewhat painstaking detail in some of the chapters of my work to note the relationship between earth and sky into archaeoastronomy, so that the earthenworks are aligned to the sun and the moon and the planets and our relationships. And probably more importantly, the stories that were utilized to convey the movement of the stars. And it becomes so complex and so beautiful that I think it's going to be a pursuit of mine for the rest of my life to figure these things out and the relationships. But many of the tribes will call them Star Lodge stories, but really understanding a lot of these cultural figures. And one of the other areas that I'm really interested in is the world of ethnobotany, so plants and humans and how they interact. And I've been becoming very intrigued with the ancient uses of certain plant medicines, which might be referred to as entheogens or psychedelics. And I believe that that also has something very profound to do with our understanding of spirituality, of God, inspirations for rock art, and perhaps even our cosmology. And so in between earth and sky and plants and humans and all of this incredible mixtures going back over 1,000 years ago and beyond, we're beginning to understand more about our past as indigenous peoples.
You mentioned this just a second ago, and I want to get back to the herbal and psychedelic. I find that fascinating. But can you talk a little bit more, about your book when it comes to sacred mathematics and archaeoastronomy and the analysis of ancient earthenworks and the ceremony sites of Turtle Island?
Very complex topic, and
I know. I know it could be. If you could put it maybe in layman's term a little bit more, where somebody like myself and my audience can understand it a little bit better.
Well, in these earthenworks, and many of them are sort of shaped by mathematics. So, in some cultures, we had rock or stone pyramids and other structures across northern Europe, across Mesoamerica, within the heartland of America, outside of what is now St. Louis in the Ohio River Valley, from going back 2,000 years ago plus with the Hopewell cultures to later mound builders, were all of these incredible earthenworks that were built into the landscape. As a matter of fact, I just came back from a visit out there to visit with some of my friends in anthropology, one of which is my friend and mentor, Dr. William Romaine, who is probably one of the leading archaeoastronomers in this space, and really learned a lot from his writings and his work. Learned a lot from Tim Pocketat, who did a great volume on Cahokia, and we began to see that there was architecture into these designs of these earthenworks. Sometimes they were conical shaped, sometimes they were linear, sometimes they were enclosures. I just came from some of these works that are around present day Chillicothe, Ohio, and in one of those areas, 25 probably square miles is just a ton of them close together. I was at the Hopeton Works and the Hopewell Works and the Seep Mounds, and Serpent Mound is one of the greatest ones, and all of those are in a couple hours. There we go.
That was one of my
distance.
first interviews about the Serpent Mound, and I still find that so fascinating. It's so beautiful, and just the work that to put that together was just amazing.
That's a great example and a great image to sort of explain what is the role of archaeoastronomy. So in ancient people's mindsets, how were they looking to the stars for inspiration for stories and lifeways? And within the serpent there, and maybe you notice there's one of behind me on the wall.
Oh, yeah, I see it now. I do.
And I've got my Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks T-shirt on today because that's the latest UNESCO World Heritage Site that we're trying to protect. So there's a lot of interesting things going on. Dr. Romaine and others did a bunch of work with the Serpent Mound, and basically on one side of the twists and turns of the serpentine aspect of Serpent Mound are lunar alignments and solar on the others, and that gets complicated, and the folks studying that will say, some of those things are more true than not, but within all of the sacred geometry of that mound itself, you're just going to see alignments to true north and celestial north, and lunar orientations to the moon and solar orientations to the sun, and the measurement of time. And it gets so complex, and I wonder as time goes along how much more we're going to learn about those things. But that's also evidence in our stories, and that's one of the things that I loved about Dr. Bill's work, as I call my friend, that as I began to learn more about the serpent there and a seemingly egg in its mouth, I realized that that was akin to one of our Cherokee stories of how the serpent eats the sun. And I've loved studying Dr. Bill's work, and ultimately he is documented through the science of archaeoastronomy that if we go back to the right period of time, several things were happening with the alignments to these earthenworks and to celestial events, but ultimately that the constellation of Scorpius was heading towards the sun at sunrise. And, the times and interactions vary, but probably around the summer solstice. And that is evidence in some of our stories, like the Cherokee story of how the serpent eats the sun. And at the Newark Works, one of my favorite examples has to do with the alignments of those very complex earthenworks to the sun, the moon, and the stars, and ultimately to the journey of the souls, that pathway of souls, which we look at as the dark rift of the Milky Way. And at the Great Circle and Octagon is a road that leads away from it, known as the Great Hopewell Road. And this is one of those cutting areas of anthropology and archaeoastronomy, where we're realizing that a lot of these sites are aligned to the Milky Way. And so pilgrims, initiates, adepts of these ancient mystery schools could go to these sites every 18.6 years. And we're actually in the season right now for that time period, going through October, to where you'll see a lot of these alignments of the moon, the minimum and maximum moonrise to the north and to the south. And then ultimately at places like Newark at the Great Hopewell Road, around the summer solstice, you'll see the dark rift of the Milky Way coming out of the southern hemisphere as one would walk along as an initiate to that path,
Wow.
ultimately seeing Scorpius eating the sun at sunrise. And we go back to a world where there was no light pollution and no cement and golf courses, which is around, right? Where all those things are I'm describing.
Right.
To a world that was at once incredibly beautiful and powerful, and this beautiful union between earth and clay and this middle realm and our connections to the sky realm or the upper realm.
I mean, that just sounds so beautiful. And in fact, the Hopewell ceremonial site, the mound is right there, I believe. Is that right?
Which side are we looking at here?
I think when I pulled it up, it said the Hopewell ceremonial.
Oh, yes. That's I was just there a couple days ago, and there's a lot of these works. And the sad part, Tony, is that over 90% of the original earthenworks were destroyed by farming and railroads and looting and other things. And we're lucky to have those that we have left.
Can you tell me these mounds, which I find them fascinating. I'm glad there are still some. I'm sure there's even more that haven't even been discovered. But how early do you believe that they started being built, and do they still build mounds now? I mean, when did they stop building these mounds in the native culture?
The oldest mounds that we're aware of right now, and again, this is one of those things that seems to be a moving target, but I got to go visit the LSU mound down not too far from the complexes we know as Watson's Break and Poverty Point, but that one's 9 to 11,000 years old.
Wow.
And it's right there on the campus of LSU, and most of the locals know it as somewhere where they could go sledding in the winter. Hopefully that perspective will change to one of reverence for its antiquity. There you go. And it's just crazy to think that 9 to 11,000 years ago, I mean, we're butting right up against, the Younger Dryas and the Ice Age and all these other major events in weather and history. And Poverty Point, Watson Break, they're going back 6,000 years. The shell mounds in Florida are even older than that, and we're just piecing all these things together. And who knows what we're going to find over time. I know that a lot of the shell midden mounds in California have been unearthed. Unfortunately, some of them happen when things are warming or climate's changing or floods, etc. But we're finding more and more about the antiquity of the lands here.
Oh my gosh, our time is flying by, and I have so many questions. We may have to do a part 2, by the way, because
I would love to do that.
I
Tony.
find this so fascinating. But you also, we've talked a little bit about your nonprofit. I do want to touch on that real quick because I think this is very important. Can you tell us more about your nonprofit and what your goal is?
Sure. Somewhere 10 years ago, and when I began to get serious about saying, I think I want to research this further and maybe turn it into something one day. It's certainly been a hobby and turned into a passion and then became something more than that. Ultimately, it resulted in a book. But as I was studying ancient Native America, trying to answer those questions of who am I and where do I come from, and how do I reconcile my two tribes and how they're interrelated, as I began to see those answers, eventually became the role of food. How does that fit into here? And around that same time now, going back probably 16, 17 years ago, I was serving on the National Council for the Cherokee Nation. And the head of our ag and sort of ethnobotany group down there, Dr. Pat Gwynn, he was just embarking on trying to figure out what was the ancient Cherokee agricultural lifeways, and began to talk about seeds. And somewhere as the years passed, eventually they started on those journeys and they went back to our relatives in North Carolina, the Eastern Band, and they began to look into seed banks. The USDA had a bunch of stuff from over 100 years ago.
Wow.
Different collections of anthropology, etc. And ultimately, we're able to bring back some of those seeds. And then there were other individuals who individually saved a lot of these seeds. Carl Barnes, a Cherokee, also comes to mind as someone who did a paramount job of collecting. In the plains, we had one seed keeper, Oscar Will, who was a non-native individual who had actually started a seed company. And even though that was commercialized, we can look to those collections today and say that he did a good job of helping preserve some of these seeds. Carl Barnes was the real champion there, in my opinion. I was actually there to witness whenever his collections were brought back together and given into an indigenous group called Braiding the Sacred. And there was well over 1,000 different varieties of indigenous seeds. And in a world we know where diversity of crops is shrinking, that becomes a part of the puzzle. Charles C. Mann, who was the author of 1491, 1493, The Wizard and the Prophet, Charles was kind enough to write the foreword for my book, and I got to spend some time with him in my gardens of sacred seed. And we discussed these topics of monocrop cultures and diversity of seeds. And I think it's just really an important part of the work that we celebrate the diversity of all these tribal seeds. And groups like Braiding the Sacred are trying to get these seeds back to the tribal peoples from which they originally came. And then it's up to us to develop our own relationship. And that's the real goal with things like sacred seed, is to not only understand the history of these agricultural lifeways and not only to plant them, but more importantly, from my perspective, to celebrate the beauty of them and to work on education, which is how everything sort of dovetailed with my book. And I go around and give talks on the importance of seed saving and the beauty of a large diversity and variety of seeds, and the cosmology that goes along with it, which ties it to religion. And to me, that's the important part as we develop a more spiritual relationship with plants and seeds and the history and cosmology that is not just a antiseptic relationship, but that it is dynamic and beautiful and deep. And if we begin to see the beauty of some of the diversity of these seeds, then hopefully we become more enamored with them. And when time passes on, we want more diversity of seeds rather than less. And industrial agriculture is moving towards monocrop. So every person has something to do with this. And I encourage everyone to plant indigenous heirloom seeds where possible, and to learn about the Three Sisters and the antiquity of that across the Americas, going back 9,000 to 10,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. So it's a tried and true system that I think we can all learn from, whether that's big industrial ag or backyard farmers and people, sustainably farming for themselves and their families.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Taylor, thank you so much. And please, this is for sure, I'll be reaching out to you and setting up a part 2. We have so much more to talk about, but people that are just tuning in or tuned in halfway through. So Taylor wrote a book that's called Turtle Island, a First Peoples account on the sacred geometry. I can't even read it. My eyes are so bad. Geography of America. There we go. I have to. Now that I'm hit an age, I have to do this now when I read.
Wear mine all the time.
I know. But it's a great book, and I love the message. And for the people that need that message, give us like a sentence or two what people can do to start getting involved more and reconnecting and understanding about indigenous people and just connecting to Mother Earth.
Well, there's a long history in these lands of indigenous peoples to Turtle Island and the Americas. And we carry the spirit of the land within us. The blood and bones of our ancestors have been in the mother here for a long time, and she knows us. And when we're trying to respect the sanctity of Mother Earth and to love her as we would our own mother, then that religion, that spirituality can only be viewed with us along with it. So we're an important part of understanding the beauty of this land. And if others want to help understand it, they need to be prepared to learn from our wisdom as indigenous peoples, how we can better preserve Mother Earth and this homeland that we all love.
And that's why I love having you and people of indigenous backgrounds on my show, because I have a little selfishness of learning from you as much as I can and trying to reconnect to the passion and love for our planet. And that's what I hope more people understand and try to reconnect as we go forward, and for not just our generations, but generations after us. So thank you, Taylor, so much for being part of Truth Be Told. We really appreciate it.
Tony, thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back on someday.
Oh, sooner than later, I promise. And thank you, everybody, for being a part of Truth Be Told. Please share and like this show. Leave comments. Say, hey, I want Taylor to come back because we know how important this is. And we want to share his amazing book, Rediscovering Turtle Island. Please, you can go to his website, rediscoveringturtleisland.com, or following on Instagram at Taylor Keen, Keen 7, Taylor Keen 7, the number 7. So until next time, I'm Tony Sweet. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. Take care. Bye. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media: Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio; Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.